we studied the Protestant reformers, we saw that one of the things that was missing was a call to a deep spiritual conversion. And in today's saint, we find the remedy for that in Saint Teresa of Avila, someone who takes the deep scholastic theological tradition of the Catholic Church and makes it personal, makes it into a mystical ecstasy and a relationship between herself and Jesus Christ. So let's look at her life and her theology and her writings. Teresa of Avila was born in 1515 in Avila, Spain. Her paternal grandfather was a Marrano. Now, a Marrano is a Jewish convert to Christianity. However, he was condemned by the Spanish Inquisition for allegedly returning to the Jewish faith. Now, subsequently, her family was genuinely Catholic, and at the age of 7, she ran away from home with her brother Rodrigo in order to seek martyrdom amongst the Moors, the Muslims. However, her uncle noticed them as he was returning to town and brought them back home. When she was 14 years old, her mother passed away, and so Teresa was sent away for education with the Augustinian nuns there at Avila. But during this time, she suffered from illness and spent her time reading devotional books. So something similar as we see in the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola, illness and then spending time reading. At the age of 20, in 1535, she entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Avila. However, Teresa was disappointed by the laxity there in the convent and also the constant stream of visitors that broke the silence and the rhythm of prayer that she sought there in the Carmelite monastery. In 1556, so she's 41 now, her friends begin to suggest that her deep ecstasies, her visions, are from demonic influence. And so she begins to inflict upon herself extreme penances. But at this time, she meets St. Francis Borgia, who was a friend of St. Ignatius of Loyola, a Jesuit. He becomes her confessor and her spiritual director, and he discerns that she's not under the influence of Satan. She is under divine inspiration, seeing and learning things from Christ himself. So from 1559 to 1561, this is her mid-40s, Teresa continues to receive mystical visions and messages from Christ. And it's at this time that she receives the transfiguration. This is an experience in which a seraph, a high angel, plunges a fiery dart or a golden lance in and out of her heart. Now on the screen you'll see the famous statue by Bernini, perhaps one of his most famous works, called The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And there you can see the angel with the fiery dart plunging it into her heart. Here's the account given by Saint Teresa of Avila of this mystical experience. Quote, "I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it." End quote. During this time period, when she's 45 years old, she also meets St. Peter of Alcantara, who becomes her spiritual director after St. Francis Borgia. In 1562, when she's 47, she founds a Reformed Carmelite convent named after St. Joseph, to whom she had great devotion. And she also finds a new interpretation of the Carmelite mystical life under the influence of St. Peter of Alcantara. And she desires to return to the primitive rule of 1209 of the Carmelites. This includes not wearing shoes but only sandals. This is why they're called discalced. And also self-flagellation, fasting from meat from September 14th, the Feast of the Holy Cross, all the way to Easter. That original rule of the Carmelites had been relaxed in the 1400s. Teresa wants to bring it back. She wants the austerity of the original Carmelite genius. So, in 1567, she receives permission to establish new houses in conformity with this interpretation of the Carmelite spiritual life, the Discalcid rule. She also wants to form new foundations of this Carmelite spirituality for men. And so during this time period, she meets John of the Cross, also Carmelite, Anthony of Jesus, and persuades them to establish a male house of Discalcid Carmelites. And by the way, in our next lesson, we'll look at St. John of the Cross. In 1576 to 1579, Teresa is persecuted, and so is her whole order and movement. And they go under the investigation of the Spanish Inquisition, but are eventually vindicated by the Pope. And then in 1582, when she's 67 years old, St. Teresa dies. And her last words were, quote, "My Lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O Lord, my God and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time to meet one another." End quote. We can see in that quote a great respect and love for Christ, but also a sweet familiarity between herself and her groom, Jesus Christ. It's interesting, she died while the Catholic Church was trying to replace the Julian calendar with the Gregorian calendar. And the Pope had decided to skip the days from October 5th to 14th. And she died during this period. So she actually died when the church had removed dates from the calendar. And so her death was placed on October 15th, and that's her feast day. She was canonized in 1622, just 40 years after she died, very rapidly, by Pope Gregory XV. And she was declared a doctor of the church, a female doctor of the church, by Pope Paul VI in 1970. During this time period, although she was a female, she was prolific in writing and composing theological and spiritual works. Let's look at her writings and then let's look at some of her theology. Before 1567, she wrote her own autobiography, and she also wrote during this time period The Way of Perfection and her own meditations on the Song of Songs. We see this over and over in the great saints of this period, beginning with St. Bernard of Clairvaux, with Thomas Aquinas, a love for the Song of Songs. We'll see it again with St. John of the Cross. In 1577, she writes her greatest work, The Interior Castle. This is an exploration of the soul as inhabited by Jesus Christ, the King, a king dwelling in his castle. She, at this time, also writes an extension to her autobiography to catch up all the things that have happened in her life. She wrote a couple of shorter works, a collection of poetry, and we have her letters, her epistles, that number around 342, though we do have some fragments of others. The spirituality of St. Teresa is rooted, not surprisingly, in the threefold way found in Thomas Aquinas, found in the early church with Dionysius the Areopagite. In fact, we could even say found in the Old Testament with the architecture of the temple. She describes 4 phases of prayer. Phase 1 is devotion of the heart. This is learning mental prayer and withdrawal from the world. It's contemplation on the suffering of Christ, a turn to penance, learning the distinction between mortal and venial sin, and the removal of mortal sin. We see this almost like a parallel with the first week in St. Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises. The second phase of prayer for St. Teresa is the removal of venial sin, or the attempt to remove all venial sin. The illuminative way, becoming educated and knowledgeable of the ways of Jesus Christ and enlightened by his grace. And also trying to remain not distracted by images, memory, thought, and worldly distractions. Teresa says during the second phase, you will continue to be distracted by your memory and your thoughts and ideas. That's okay, just keep going. So there's a very, very down-to-earth realism in the spirituality of Teresa. Now, the third phase is the devotion of union. And Teresa refers to this as a time of conscious rapture, blissful absorption into God. It's contemplation. It's not necessarily verbal. It's not necessarily her or you speaking words to God and God speaking back to you. It's more of a gaze between the soul and God. And then the highest, the fourth phase, is the devotion of ecstasy. This is where the Christian loses all awareness of the body, memory, imagination, This would be, for example, St. Teresa's transverberation. It's a flowing between pain and sweetness. There's a negation of all the bodily faculties and senses. And Teresa says during this experience, one can experience physical levitation off the earth. She also states that if a person experiences this fourth phase of ecstasy, it can take hours to recover physically from what happens spiritually. This fourfold way is actually an adaptation, as I mentioned before, of Thomas Aquinas: purification, illumination, and union. But this fourth phase of ecstasy, of transverberation, of a lack of awareness, a losing awareness of the body, the memory, and the imagination, this is just me speaking here personally, but it makes me think to the last year of the life of Thomas Aquinas, in which it's said he begins to levitate in a chapel. He receives visions from Christ. And after his vision on the feast of St. Nicholas in the year before he dies, he loses his call, his interest in writing didactic theology. Thomas Aquinas stops writing the Summa Theologiae. And so it makes me wonder if perhaps Thomas Aquinas, a couple centuries before Teresa of Avila, himself enters this fourth phase of prayer, the devotion of ecstasy. Just something I wanted to throw out there, and I think it does actually conform to the theology and the life of Thomas Aquinas. On that same note, I'd like to personally recommend to all the members of the New St. Thomas Institute the writings of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. He is one of my favorite theologians and philosophers. He instructed Pope St. John Paul II in his doctoral dissertation. And Garrigou-Lagrange takes the mystical theology of Teresa of Avila and combines it with the scholastic theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. There's a short 130-page version of his book called The Three Conversions of the Spiritual Life. We'll include a link in the notes. Please pick up that book and bless yourself with his reflections. So there she is, St. Teresa of Avila. She brings a personal scholasticism, is what I would call it. She takes the great theology of the likes of Thomas Aquinas and makes it personal. She places it inside an interior castle and invites Christ to dwell there. St. Teresa of Avila, pray for us. Thank you for being a member of the New St. Thomas Institute. We'll see you in the next lesson with St. John of the Cross.